I'd like to start by thanking the Centre for London, not only for the opportunity to speak today, but for all the brilliant work it continues to do. I see this think tank as our city's brain trust, constantly putting out high quality, thoughtful and timely work, something that will be more important than ever as we look to solve the huge challenges we face in the months, years and decades ahead. And I really enjoyed reading the recent London at a Crossroads report, a thought-provoking piece that highlighted some of the choices and challenges in London's future. I must begin by talking about the important news from the weekend and the impact this will have on our city. The way the government dithered and delayed over recent weeks meant that the Prime Minister was left with no choice but to introduce a second national lockdown. If we've learned anything since the start of this pandemic, is that the best way to control this virus is to act early and decisively. That's why I, along with many others, spent weeks urging the government to listen to the scientific advice and to introduce a short national circuit breaker when we still could. This would not only have saved lives, but enabled us to avoid the terrible economic harm that a longer national lockdown will now inevitably cause. I know many Londoners and businesses across our city will be extremely angry that the right action was not taken at the right time. I am too. But I'm certainly not going to make a political speech today. That being said, we can't varnish the truth because the fact is we've all been let down by central government and the consequences will be devastating. More lives lost, more jobs at risk, and more livelihoods ruined. It's now absolutely imperative that the government doesn't repeat the same mistakes when it comes to the additional economic support that will clearly be needed. Ministers have a once-in-a-generation responsibility to provide the public funding required to prop up our economy through this period. And as Mayor, I can assure you that I'll continue to put pressure on the government to do whatever's needed. It's clear that the months and years ahead are going to be extremely tough, testing our city unlike any time since the Second World War. We don't yet know what the full extent of the economic and social impact will be on London, or how many of the changes we've seen already are temporary or represent a more permanent shift. But it's hard not to conclude that major structural change is affecting our city over a very compressed timescale. This is likely to have significant ramifications for public transport, planning, economic development, and quality of life. I've always believed that politicians must be honest with the public. That's why I'll never downplay or shy away from acknowledging these difficult challenges that London faces, particularly now as we enter another national lockdown. But that doesn't mean I still don't hold out hope for the future, because out of darkness, we've already seen some chinks of light, particularly how in these turbulent times, Londoners have not turned their backs on each other. Instead, they've pulled together and looked out for one another. We've seen the clap for carers, which started here in London and became a weekly national ritual. Londoners dropping off food for vulnerable and older neighbours, and complete strangers phoning one another to ward off loneliness and poor mental health. These countless small acts of community kindness have shown how Londoners together can make a real difference. None of this surprises me because I know this city and I know Londoners. After all, I owe London everything. It gave me the opportunities to go from the council estate where I grew up to being mayor. And my overarching ambition and vision today remains the same as when I was first elected: to make London a fairer place where everyone gets the opportunities our city gave to me and my family, where everyone, regardless of their race, religion, class, sexuality, or background, gets the chance to reach their full potential. And despite the enormous challenges ahead, my belief that we can build this more equal city has not been diminished. Because over the last 4 years, we've already shown what's possible, from making massive strides in tackling air pollution to starting to build a record number of council homes last year. And now, as a city, I believe we can rally around our shared hopes for the future, for a fairer, cleaner, greener city where a greater emphasis is put on the quality of life, where we no longer take for granted the delivery drivers, postal workers, refuse collectors, health and transport workers, all those who prevented our city from collapsing in recent months, where we invest in our young people, where we build the affordable homes for the many, not the luxury penthouses for the privileged few, where our precious diversity is championed for what it is, not a weakness, but our city's greatest strength, where we tackle head on the poverty, deprivation, and poor health that's been exposed and exacerbated by COVID-19, and where the deep-seated racial inequalities that have scarred our society for decades are not only fully acknowledged, but tackled with the urgency it deserves. Already, the work has started. London's Recovery Board is bringing together representatives from the public, private, and voluntary sectors. We've set ourselves an overarching grand challenge of restoring confidence in our city, minimizing the impact on communities, and building back better our economy and society. We've already established 9 missions covering a range of key structural challenges we face. These cover areas like skills, high streets, mental health, digital access, and support for young people. It's a totally new way of working that's helping to break down barriers between organisations, and it's leading others across London to look at how they can contribute to the missions and pool our resources and expertise, which is exactly what's going to be needed and needs to happen. There's certainly a long way to go, but the foundations are in place for building a better London. And for as long as I'm mayor, I'll be driven every single day to deliver this mission and this vision, driven to use the way Londoners have been pulling together as a springboard for positive change, and driven by my overwhelming desire to build a better London that truly works for everyone. Londoners pulling together will also be critical as we deal with an increasingly hostile domestic environment. We have a government that seems happy to undermine our capital city and that attacks us to shore up their vote in other parts of the country. It feels like London has too often become the scapegoat for many of Britain's problems. But stoking populist division is a dangerous game, one that never leads to progress for those who feel neglected, only more conflict, bitterness, and disharmony. Things certainly don't feel much like a United Kingdom at the moment. Sometimes other parts of the country point the finger at London. But this unhappiness is misdirected. Too often it's not London, but Whitehall and Westminster that's the source of unhappiness. Our city should not be tarred with the failings of the national government simply because it's based in SW1. Of course, I see how some decisions by this government can look London-centric and annoy colleagues in the north. But when cities and regions bicker, we fall into the government's trap because it's in their interests that we're pitted against one another, fighting a zero-sum game over money. It means they can retain control at a national level, and it deflects from the actual problems we should be focusing on, from ensuring sufficient investment in all our areas to getting much more meaningful devolution so that we can weaken the stranglehold of Whitehall. So instead of succumbing to the government's divide and rule tactics, we need to rally together. The truth is, we have so much in common. I know that the people of Liverpool, Manchester, and Sheffield sometimes feel remote from Whitehall, but so do the people of Lewisham, Mitcham, and Southall. And take it from me, from my position as Mayor of London, it certainly doesn't feel like London is getting special treatment from this government. Quite the opposite. Just look at the way ministers have tried to impose punitive conditions on transport for London, even though Londoners have done the right thing to tackle COVID-19. Thankfully, we managed to see off the worst of the conditions that the government wanted. But I find it hard to express my anger and frustration at how much time and effort was spent on these negotiations when the sole focus should be on the real priority, fighting the pandemic. I believe this fight over TfL was a prime example of why we need to work together across cities and regions. Because without a successful, locally accountable TfL, there will be little future for transport for the North, transport for the West Midlands, and so on. So unless we resist the temptation to turn on each other and instead stick together and stand up for the funding and the powers that all mayors need, we'll allow the government to dictate the terms. The fact is, our country needs a total reset in how things are run. Gone are the days of Whitehall knows best. These aren't my words, but those of the government's own manifesto less than a year ago. Londoners need much more say over how their taxes are levied and spent and how our whole city is run. The same is true for Mancunians, Liverpudlians, Brummies, and Sheffielders. Shamefully, instead of working with local authorities and mayors during the pandemic, the government has been hoarding more power in the centre, all under the cover of a national emergency. The London plan is being undermined. TfL is being squeezed. More and more national controls are being added to areas of devolved responsibility, like affordable housing. And a new era of austerity is being forced on London, with deep budget cuts facing the GLA and London councils, as well as other public services. All of this is threatening the very institutions of local democracy. And it's a massive distraction at a time when all our focus should be on tackling COVID-19. And by the way, none of this is about me, Andy Burnham, or Steve Rotherham. It's about standing up for the integrity of our institutions and the importance of devolution. In London, the mayoralty was created with a strong democratic mandate in a referendum. Attempts to unpick this by stealth are simply illegitimate and wrong. We can't afford to go back to how it was when London lacked any kind of strategic leadership. That's why we all need to be ready for the battles ahead. Londoners, business groups, local authorities, and people across civil society. And it's why we need to stand in solidarity with our colleagues across the country. Because as a powerful block of towns, cities, regions, and devolved administrations, we can challenge the status quo. So let me just finish with this, Ben. It's going to be very tough for our city for some time to come, and the recovery will be a bumpy road. We have a duty to do all we can to protect businesses and organizations until we can come out of the other side of this pandemic. And we'll all need to rally together as we ride out the coming months. But I have no doubt will prevail. The energy and ingenuity of Londoners will get us through and drive our recovery. It was King George VI who, during the Blitz, said, "It is not the walls that make the city, but the people who live within them." The walls of London may be battered, but the spirit of the Londoner stands resolute and undismayed. Well, I stand resolute with today's Londoners because together, I believe we can build a better London and show why we really are the greatest city in the world. Thank you.